My uncle left me a shifty little bar in his will. Here's why you should always appreciate good employees.
I started receiving weird VHS tapes in the mail. I never asked for them, but they keep arriving day after day. In every package is a note telling me the exact time to share it with the world, to get it seen by as many people as possible. If I don't, they said, bad things will happen. The following presentation is the contents of one of those tapes. Please help me and watch until the end.
Series, I like my bar. It's gross and dirty and everything here is always broken, but I loved it the second I came inside. The employees are a handful, but you learn not to let that bother you. They just enjoy playing pranks and I'm one step ahead of those most of the time anyways. Take Andrick for example. Andrick's thing used to be to pour stuff over me. I've had potato chips, confetti, sugar. He wanted to give flour a try too, but when I saw him weirdly perched on the counter with something hidden behind his back, I could see it coming from a mile away. I just walked right up to him and said, if you do that, I'll have you clean it out. I'll lean over the sink and you're gonna wash it out. I was actually serious. Andrick lowered his head and slowly slid off the counter. Considering that, a lot of things here aren't exactly as bad as they seem. There was still plenty Uncle Mac had seen fit to warn me about though. What I'm about to tell you happened very early on. I think it might have even been before I met Cole. I wasn't used to anything yet. Rather, I was still trying to wrap my head around all the strangeness that had so suddenly been thrust upon me. I was standing behind the counter on a slow day, reading one of my uncle's letters. Dear Julia, about the backroom people. You've probably noticed by now, but they're not as bad as they seem at first glance. They're pranks included. I bet you've gotten a couple tripwires already. I've had to go through the exact same thing. But it's okay. They need you as much as you need them. But it's important you do not make them dislike you. You can anger them. Sure. Punish them for jokes that go too far, but don't be cruel. You're probably not the type for that, but I'm still saying it just to be safe. You don't want to know how they can get when you give them reason to hate you. In case you do want to know though, you'll find the whole story in the letter after this one. Or maybe you can ask Andrick about it. Perhaps he likes you enough to let you in on it more carefully. I don't know. Just consider it a fair warning. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. I looked up from the letter in confusion. I figured I really should ask Andrick first, but upon turning around, I found myself face to face with him. I let out a tiny gasp and he took a step back and apologized. Did you see the letter? I asked. He nodded. So I asked what it was about. He took the piece of paper from my hand and scanned it hurriedly before giving it back to me. I don't want to talk about that. You're still adjusting and you just end up being afraid. You've got a job to do. Just try to get used to that first before digging into something you might not like finding out. Come on. This place has spooked me plenty of times already. I can handle it. Andrick shook his head. Please, just be patient. There's being able to handle something and there's being able to handle it well. Two different things. Easy to confuse. I gave in, but of course, I read the letter that night when he and the others were asleep in the back room. I know I might have been better off heeding his advice, but there's just some things you can't push into the back of your mind and ignore. This was one of those. There was also the intrigue of Uncle Mac's secret life. Reading his letters always gave me this uncanny yet familiar feeling. I had known this man, but not really. While he was alive, I hadn't thought him to be interesting in the least. But now, it's a very strange thing to think about. I sat down in one of the corner booths with the letter. The bar was silent and empty. The only light that was still on was the tiny tabletop lamp in front of me, illuminating the pages in my hands. The image of Uncle Mac the way I'd known him, a tall, heavy yet visibly strong man with stubbles on his chin and unkempt brown hair, was still fresh in my mind when I began to read. Dear Julia, my father wasn't a good man. His name was Steve. Nobody who knew Steve liked him. He had a superficial kind of charm, but once you spent more time around him, the true colors started to show. It was his job to run the bar, and while he was popular with the regulars, that slimy arsehole treated the employees like shit. For your information, Leah, the backroom people don't need much. If they ever want anything, they'll be very direct about it, and you should grant them what little they ask of you. But there's no need to pamper them. They're made for doing what they do. This place is their life. You're probably wondering what they are exactly. They've been called a lot of names throughout history in different cultures, but none of those descriptions really capture the essence of our four spirits. My grandmother called them domovoi. My grandfather insisted they were brownies, but in essence, they are fairies of the hearth. Domestic spirits. Creatures that at one point have been attached or attached themselves to a house or a family and seek to establish order there. They are helpful, mischievous at times and spiteful when angry, but most of the time, they are quite alright. As for Andrik and the others, they are a little different from the old tales. For one, a house spirit's presence is more often felt and seen, but these guys just strut around the bar like they own the place. They're not very shy. Also, instead of just sowing dissension or whatever when provoked, they've gotten violent before. My dad always used to take me to the bar with him, even when I was little. He said he wanted me to get used to everything, but I think he just wanted me to be the extra hand. He was the kind of guy who cleaned glasses with his spit. You know, back when I was little, the backroom people were very nice to me. They'd try to take on most chores that were given to me so I'd have more time to play. My father, however, wasn't as popular with them, and for good reason. He chased them around, scream at them, call them names, and he even threw a glass at one of the girls one time after closing. I have to be honest, he frightened me when he'd get like that. Worse yet, I could see the backroom people growing increasingly discontent with him, but they appeared to be less afraid than furious. I would often ask my father why he wasn't being nicer to them. I simply didn't get it. They were perfectly friendly. They never did anything wrong. Dad just laughed and said, "They're not human. Boy, they're more like devils than people, and someone has to put the fear of God into them." That settled the matter for him. I saw it was getting worse though. These hateful glances the backroom people would shoot him, how they'd whisper to each other when he wasn't listening. I had a feeling something very bad was about to happen. And soon. You can only hit a dog with a stick for so long until it starts biting you. It was Andrik that bit. I saw him go down to the back room in broad daylight one day. Nobody had told him to go there. I was confused, obviously, so I followed him. I stayed at the top of the staircase and watched as he knelt down in the middle of the room, his back turned to me. He was sitting up straight, his head lowered almost abjectly. He was mumbling something, but I could only pick up on snippets of what he was saying. It was something along the lines of "Have mercy on my soul and forgive my disrespect," but I wasn't quite certain. It was an unnerving sight. Andrik had always been this calm, lively guy, but right then, he looked almost menacing. I was nervous, so I shifted my weight on my feet, causing the floorboards below me to creak. I winced, and Andrik's head jerked around. I backed away, but he'd already seen me. He hurriedly stood up and quickly climbed the stairs. He grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me back inside, shutting the door behind us. I stared up at him with wide eyes, nervous and uncertain. I didn't know what I'd just overheard, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. "Hey buddy," Andrik said, crouching down to get on eye level with me. The softness of his voice took me by surprise. I had expected him to be mad at me, but he didn't seem to be. Not at all. "So, can you keep a secret?" Don't get me wrong. I knew this wasn't right, but I didn't want to risk testing him, so I said yes. "Then I'd really like for you not to tell anybody you saw me pray." He tilted his head. "I'll know if you tattle on me." "I won't," I promised, my heart sinking. Curiosity overtook me though, and I stammered, "What were you praying for?" "Forgiveness." "Did you do something bad?" He smiled bitterly and shook his head. "No, but there's something bad I'm gonna have to do soon. It's necessary." He paused and looked me over with a sad expression, like he felt sorry for me. "Can you do something else for me? When you're home tonight, please go to bed early and don't get up." I would have done anything just to end that conversation, so I quickly nodded and told him I would. Andrik patted my shoulder and walked past me. I tried hard to sleep that night, but despite my efforts, I laid awake. My talk with Andrik had really shaken me up. I wasn't sure what it was he was going to do, but I was afraid nevertheless. My mother and father had already gone off to bed a long time ago and were peacefully asleep, just like my baby brother and sister in the room next to mine. I kept glancing over at my alarm clock, which is how I knew that it was around 3 in the morning when I heard a strange noise coming from somewhere downstairs. It was a kind of metallic clattering. I got up from bed and quietly opened the door that led out into the hallway. I tried to make as little noise as possible as I sneaked down the stairs and around the corner. It was coming from the kitchen. I was sure of it. To get into our kitchen you'd have to walk through the living room first. So that's what I did. I crouched down and crawled over to behind the couch where I decided to stay and hide. I figured who or whatever was rummaging around back there wouldn't spot me, but since the kitchen was open and not separated from the living room, I could still look inside from where I was hiding if I just leaned over a little. I carefully peered out from behind the couch, just in time to see the oven door swing open. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. Our oven was of a normal size, able to fit a turkey but not a person. And yet, from behind the door, two hands emerged, grabbing onto either side. They were followed by a head and then a neck and shoulders. A loud creaking noise accompanied the intruder as he slowly pulled himself out of the oven and onto the tiled floor. More and more of him came slithering out of that confined, dark space, not unlike an enormous snake emerging from its lair. It was grotesque, the way his limbs bent and stretched as he crawled outside. No human body could ever move that way. I clung to the edge of the couch cushion, trying to keep my hands from trembling and my heart from beating too fast for fear the man would somehow impossibly hear it. Finally, he rose to his feet. I watched as he looked around in the kitchen in the darkness. There was a block of knives on the counter and he grabbed one by the handle and pulled it out. It was slim and sharp. He held it up as though he was considering it. My stomach turned. The man let out a soft sigh and, knife in hand, made his way out into the living room. He walked by me without even stopping and my heart leapt with relief. However, when the moonlight coming in through one of the living room windows fell onto his face, I found it to be strikingly familiar. Don't get me wrong. I had known all along it was Andrik, but there's a difference between knowing something and realizing it. He made his way upstairs, his feet not making a single sound as he carried himself across the floor. I waited until I was sure he'd reached the hallway above before I crept out from my hiding spot and followed him with bated breath. When I arrived on the upper floor, I found that the door to my parents' bedroom stood open. I hid behind the doorframe and cautiously peered inside. My mind was racing with thoughts of what he was going to do. Would he kill my father? Stab him or slit his throat? I wanted to do something. Stop him somehow, but I couldn't. I knew if I were to try and fight him, it'd be my death sentence. That I was sure of, in hindsight. Maybe if I'd just screamed loudly to wake up my parents, Andrik would have fled. But as a little boy that simply didn't occur to me. My breathing had become faster and more labored, and I covered my mouth and nose with my hand trying to quiet it. From where I was cowering, I could see my mom and dad sleeping in their bed. Andrik was sitting on the floor to my father's side. He had turned on the small lamp on his nightstand, the light of which was just dim enough not to wake up either of my parents. I watched as he peeled away the blanket and pulled out my father's arm. He then brought the blade of the knife to his mouth and, to my surprise, slowly dragged his tongue across it. I could see his spit glistening on the tip. He was holding Dad's arm in place with his other hand and, mumbling something I couldn't quite understand, lowered the wet knife down to Steve's exposed palm. I knew he'd cut him because the knife came back slightly bloodied. Andrik carefully sat the weapon aside and pressed Dad's palm into a tight fist with both hands. He was still whispering to himself until he eventually withdrew, picked up the knife and got to his feet. Realizing he was coming back, I quickly slid behind a nearby cabinet, hoping he wouldn't see me. He didn't. Andrik calmly walked back outside, shut the door behind himself and went back downstairs, only stopping on his way to straighten a framed photo hanging on the wall. I heard water running down in the kitchen and assumed he was cleaning the knife, followed by the sound of the oven door being opened and shut. When I was certain he was gone, I went back to bed. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, too terrified to sleep. My father was changed that night. Everyone, in and outside of our family, noticed. He had completely lost his temper. He didn't yell or shout anymore, but neither did he smile or laugh. When he wasn't working at a bar, he just sat around at home, staring into the distance like a zombie. He ate and slept and all that, but it was as though the rest of him had vanished. He rarely talked, and when he did, it was mostly just nonsensical rambling in an eerily soft voice. I was still very young at the time. Seeing my old man like that frightened me and I avoided him like the plague. I never told mom about what really happened that night. She sought out the help of doctors for both the body and the mind, never giving up hope that her husband would return to her the way he used to be someday. I was the only one who knew that no earthly medicine could ever cure my father of what had befallen him. I was the only one who knew of Andrik's curse. Steve died early, when he was in his late 50s. I took over the bar and that was that. At first, I was wary of Andrik, but I wasn't about to make the same mistake as my dad. I was always nice to him and the others, and eventually, they started viewing me as a point of trust, even a friend. That, Julia, is the type of relationship you want to have with the backroom people. Be their friend, but a friend with authority, a good boss. Basically, there's no need to be afraid of them, and when there is, well, you'll be the first to know. Now, I know you well enough. Kid, you're mellow, unlikely to lash out, but still, I didn't sit down and write out this childhood experience like it was a horror story for nothing, so please do take it to heart. I don't want to scare you, it's simply a warning. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. That was how I found out more about the backroom people. Of course, it was hardly all there was to know about them, but it was a start. Mac's letter had left me with a queasy feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach that day. As much as I hated to admit it, Andrik had probably been correct. I really should have waited a bit longer. Better yet, when I kept to myself the following day, he immediately knew what was up. He caught me on my way out of the bathroom. "You found out about Steve, didn't you?" he began. I nodded slowly. "Okay, listen, I'm not planning on doing anything to hurt you.